All right, and let's begin. So today we're going to be talking about assistance animals. And before I get started, I want to also thank our interpreters as well as our captioner for helping us to make this program accessible for everyone. Um, we always start out our fair housing trainings by talking about how everybody has the right to fair housing. Housing is so crucial to being able to access all of the goods and services and everything you need for a healthy and thriving life. So at PHRC, we put a very strong emphasis on fair housing and its importance. I do want to let you know, and there's a disclaimer on the screen, that this is not legal advice. This is simply information and training on our fair housing laws. Before we get started, I also want to discuss our training goals this morning so you have a sense of where we're going in the hour ahead. So we are going to start off with a short introduction to PHRC for those of you who are not familiar with our agency. Uh, we will identify relevant fair housing laws, protected classes, as well as discriminatory practices. And then we're going to be talking about fair housing for individuals with disabilities, focusing on reasonable accommodations and modifications with specifics um, on assistance animals, since that's our topic for today. We will close out by providing an overview of the fair housing complaint process for anyone who believes that they've experienced housing discrimination and how to file with our agency. And we will also seek to answer any fair housing questions that you have. So I encourage you to enter any questions or comments that you have in the chat as we go about the presentation. I will attempt to answer as many of them in real time as we can. I may also ask you to put some responses in the chat. So please feel free to use that tool that we have available to us. And we'll also hold a little bit of time at the end for any additional questions. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is Pennsylvania's leading civil rights enforcement agency. We've been around since 1955, and we exist to make sure that Pennsylvanians can live, work, and learn free from unlawful discrimination. We accomplish this through a two-part mission. So first, we enforce Pennsylvania's non-discrimination laws, which include both the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So these laws enable us to investigate complaints when they come to our agency to see if unlawful discrimination has occurred. But beyond simply responding to complaints as they come into our agency, we also work to actively promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. So how do we do that? We hold educational training sessions like the one that you're attending today. We hold events and other gatherings, ways that we can promote equal opportunity for all. We also have a robust advisory council program and social justice ambassador program, which enable community members to get involved deeply with our work, helping to share the information with members in their community, making sure that everyone is fully aware of our state's protections and resources. And they can also report issues back to us when there are issues that impact equal opportunity for Pennsylvanians. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania, and you can see our regions on the map on the screen. So the western part of the state is in that dark blue shaded color, and that's served by our Pittsburgh Regional Office. Our Harrisburg Regional Office serves the central area of the state, and that's in that light blue. And then our Philadelphia Regional Office covers the portion of the state in the medium blue. Um, and those regional offices are the ones that uh, are the folks and members of our staff that accept complaints and investigate our cases. There's also a central office that does outreach and administrative functions. I mentioned our laws just a minute ago, and I want to share what they cover. So you can see that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act really does a lot of the heavy lifting out of our two laws. So in addition to housing, which we're discussing today, it also covers employment, commercial property, public accommodations such as public businesses and services, as well as primary and secondary education up through high school. The Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act extends that coverage into post-secondary education, such as colleges, trade schools, and technical schools. And if you'd like more information about our agency in general, you can go on our website and we've got a lot of fantastic information on there. But we are going to move on to talk about our fair housing laws. Before I do that, I'd love to invite you all to put into the chat what you think the goals of fair housing are. What do you think we're seeking to accomplish with fair housing? What is the purpose of having fair housing laws? What do they do? I'd love to see some of your thoughts if anyone is willing to share. All right, to make sure that everyone has access to quality and affordable housing in Pennsylvania, that's a big part of it. Non-discrimination in housing, absolutely. Ensuring all members of the Commonwealth can access safe, dignified housing and equal treatment throughout the Commonwealth. Absolutely, these are all important parts of fair housing. At PHRC, we talk about fair housing as having two goals. So the first one, ending housing discrimination, making sure that no one is kept out of housing opportunities because of their protected class or aspects of their identity. But beyond that, fair housing works to promote diverse, inclusive communities, and that's known as affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's a part of the Fair Housing Act, recognizing that for many years we had discriminatory laws and practices, and that's really shaped our housing throughout the Commonwealth and beyond. So there's a lot of active work that we need to do regardless of what role you have today, whether you're coming as a housing provider, a social service provider, an interested community member, a community leader, we all have a role to play in promoting diverse, inclusive communities, and that's what fair housing is about. Our fair housing laws cover the sale and rental of housing, as well as housing-related transactions. And by housing-related transactions, I'm talking about appraisals, I'm talking about insurance, I'm talking about the ability to get a mortgage, all of those industries that can surround housing and shape access to housing. The types of housing that are covered by our fair housing laws are really broad. So it's anything from our apartments to single-family homes, manufactured housing communities, condominiums, public housing nursing homes, dormitories, and more. Even some types of shelters are covered by our fair housing laws. And there's a wide variety, a wide range of parties who are responsible to know and abide by our fair housing laws. So anyone from a property owner to a manager to an HOA board or association to municipal officials, lenders, realtors, and more. There are two primary discrimination theories or types of discrimination that I'm going to be talking about today. The first is disparate treatment. So that's treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So if we're looking at the protected class of disability, and someone with a disability is going to go visit an open unit to view it, and the property manager comes out and says, you know what, I'm sorry, because of your disability, I don't think that this place is safe for you, so I'm not going to rent you this apartment. They were directly denied, discriminated against because of their protected class. So that's disparate treatment. Disparate impact can be a little bit more subtle and a little bit harder to spot. So that's a policy that's neutral on its face, but it has a disproportionate or disparate impact on a member of a protected class. So again, if we're looking at the protected class of disability, that could look like it could look like a policy at a rental complex that says that everyone to qualify for to live there, they need to have full-time employment. So this is a policy that can have disparate impact because when we look at the numbers and the statistics around employment, we know that individuals with disabilities are less likely to have full-time employment. So this is a barrier that's going to disproportionately impact members of a protected class of individuals with disabilities. I also want to note that our captioner put in the chat the link to access the captions. So for anyone who would like captions for this program, you can view them in the chat there. We have several different layers of fair housing laws. So there are laws at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. At the federal level, there's the Fair Housing Act of 1968. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which applies to federally assisted housing, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and that provides additional protections for individuals with disabilities. At the state level, as I mentioned at the top of our program, it's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act that forms the basis for our protections. There are also protections at the local level through local human relations ordinances as well. So there are over 70 different human relations ordinances throughout the state of Pennsylvania. I know we've got folks joining us on this call from areas all across the Commonwealth. I'd love for anyone who's familiar with any local ordinances in their area to put them in the chat and to let us know. So the federal protections form the basis and the floor, the 7 basic protected classes. We add a few more at the state level, and then in various localities, there are additional protections. So if you're a housing provider, it's important to know if there's any local ordinances in your area. All right, we're going to briefly touch on jurisdiction. So, so which providers are covered by our fair housing laws? Under the Federal Fair Housing Act, it's housing providers who have 4 or more properties, unless they publicly advertise their vacancies or receive federal funding. So smaller landlords with 3 or fewer properties would be exempt unless they advertise their vacancies or receive federal funding. At the state level, it's a little bit simpler, so housing providers with 1 or more properties. So it's possible that even if a housing provider is exempt from the Fair Housing Act, they may still have responsibilities under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. If you believe that you've experienced housing discrimination, you can file a complaint with our agency and get that investigated. Under our state act, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, you need to file within 180 days of the date of the last harm, about 6 months. If you want to file a federal discrimination complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, you have up to a year, which is a little bit longer, and that's also from the date of the last harm. On my next slide, I've got lists of protected classes, both at the federal and the state level. Before I advance to that slide, I'd like to invite anyone who's familiar with protected classes to put them in the chat right now. Let us know let's see if we can brainstorm the various protected classes. All right, we've got national origin in the chat. Absolutely. What are some other areas protected classes? Age, yeah, absolutely. Age 40 and above. Religion, absolutely. What are some other protected classes? Race, yeah. Disability, absolutely. Any other ones that come to mind? Sex, yep. Anything else? Yeah, families with children, familial status. All right, I'm seeing pregnancy status and LGBTQ, which would both fall under sex under our regulations. Familial status, ESA, absolutely. You guys did great. I think we got most of them. So let's see. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that there are 7 protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So there's race, there's color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got our protected classes under our state protections under the Human Relations Act. And that closely mirrors the federal uh, protected classes. So we've got race, color, national origin, familial status, religious creed, sex, disability, and then we add on age 40 and above, ancestry, as well as the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. And I'm going to go into greater detail on a few of these protected classes. So familial status is a protected class that we often get questions on. So that includes families with children under the age of 18 who are living with their parents or their legal custodians. That includes people who are pregnant, as well as people who are securing custody of children under the age of 18, including foster children, not just biological children. Now, there is an exemption for this protected class, and that's housing covered by the Housing for Older Persons Act. So 55 and older and 62 and over communities may be exempt to renting to families with children and other folks who are under those age groups. And you can find more information online about the Housing for Older Persons Act and what those specifics are. I want to discuss sex as a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act as well. So you didn't see LGBTQ or sexual orientation, gender identity listed as separate protected classes either at the federal or the state level. However, in 2023, we finalized regulations that defined the protected class of sex. And those regulations establish that that term sex may refer to pregnancy status, childbirth status, breastfeeding status, sex assigned at birth, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, as well as differences in sex development. And we use these regulations as our staff accepts complaints, conducts investigations, and adjudicates cases. Now, I want to highlight this because under previous administrations, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development also accepted complaints on sexual orientation and gender identity under the protected class of sex, and that's changed. However, at the state level, we still are accepting and conducting investigations based on these regulations, which do allow PHRC to look into those cases. So if you believe that you've experienced housing discrimination based on your sexual orientation, your gender identity, or any of those definitions, you have the right to file a complaint with our agency and get that investigated. If you'd like more information on that, you can find the link on the slide there. And I do want to note that the slides and recording will be sent out to everyone after this presentation. Next, I'd like to talk about disability since that's the focus of our presentation today. It's defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. Some examples of this include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. That's not an exhaustive list, but just some examples of how a disability may limit one or more of a person's major life activities. Our fair housing laws protect those who have a disability, those who have a history of a disability, as well as those who are regarded as having a disability. Now, I do want to note that there's some exemptions under this protected class as well. So individuals who are currently using illegal drugs or controlled substances are exempted from disability-related protections. This does not include those who are in active recovery. So if someone is in active recovery, they would still have disability-related protections, but individuals who are currently using illegal drugs would not. Additionally, individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others are exempt from disability-related protections. I see a question in the chat about disability status. Does that need to be deemed so by Social Security or another agency? No, it does not. As long as it would, someone's disability would meet that definition of that substantial limitation of one or more of a person's major life activities, they would qualify. I apologize. Um, and I see a question in the chat about what's meant by a direct threat to the health and safety of others. It's something that should be substantial and substantiated. It shouldn't be something that's simply a rumor or a perception. There should be something that can be documented about the threat that this individual's behavior would be posing to others at the property. I've got a list of some discriminatory actions on this slide. I don't want to go in great detail because I know we have a lot to cover in the upcoming 40 minutes, but here's some examples of what housing discrimination might look like. It might be discriminatory statements, whether that's in an advertisement or a conversation, discriminatory inquiries about someone's protected class as they're seeking to rent a home or buy a home, steering someone to a certain neighborhood, to a certain complex, to a certain floor based on their protected class, refusing to sell, lease, or finance housing, simply denying them housing, conducting an unfair appraisal that's based on their protected class, predatory lending, offering worse terms and conditions, limiting access to lending, discriminating in the housing terms and conditions. So that might look like the terms in a lease agreement, unequal provision of services and facilities. That could look like limiting access to the pool, the laundry room, the common spaces, not providing maintenance services or delaying providing maintenance services, sexual harassment or harassment based on any protected class, as well as refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications, which we'll be talking about next. So the bulk of our presentation is going to be on disability-related protections. So we receive a lot of complaints based on disability, and it's the highest number of complaints out of any protected class. So in addition to all the protections that we covered so far, individuals with disabilities may also request reasonable accommodations and modifications that are needed to use and enjoy their housing. All right, so what's the difference between reasonable modifications and accommodations? We're going to go into that, but while I do that, I'd love to encourage you to put in the chat any reasonable modifications or accommodations that you're familiar with in housing. So reasonable modifications are when there's a structural change that's made to the premises, and reasonable accommodation is when there's a change, exception, adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service. All right, so I'm seeing adding handrails, ramps. Yes, those are all great examples of reasonable modifications, changes that might be needed to a premises to allow someone to use and enjoy their housing. A stair chair lift. How about a reasonable accommodation example? What's a policy change that might be needed for someone to be able to use and enjoy their housing? And I'll give you a hint. Our topic of conversation today, assistance animals, is one of those as well. So we see some tub cuts and wider doorways, which would be modifications, ESAs, which are a type of assistance animal, non-smoking areas outside, a policy change, a parking request for reserve parking. Great examples. Thank you everyone for putting those in the chat. Accepting rent in the middle of the month due to a Social Security payment made in the middle of the month. Modifications to the kitchen. Yeah, there is a wide range of adjustments that might be needed to help someone be able to access housing in the area of their choosing. I'm going to do a quick definition of modifications and accommodations, and then we'll go into the process. So it is discriminatory to allow a person with a disability permission to refuse to allow a person with a disability permission to modify and pay for changes that enable them to use a facility. So to state that in a clearer way, it's the housing provider's responsibility to grant permission to make those changes, and it's the tenant's responsibility to pay for those changes. That is, unless it's a federally assisted property. So if the housing provider or manager receives federal funds, then it's their responsibility to pay for the modification, not the tenant. But in the private rental market, then it's the tenant's responsibility. And I also want to note that a housing provider or manager may require the resident to restore the interior to the original condition at the end of tenancy, minus wear and tear. So examples we covered in the chat, grab bars in the bathroom or handrails, as well as construction of a ramp for an individual in a wheelchair. Reasonable accommodations. So it would be discriminatory to refuse to make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, practices, or services necessary to afford equal opportunity for a person with a disability to use and enjoy a housing accommodation. So some examples of that would be not allowing a person with disability income to pay the rent on a different date than other tenants, not designated reserved parking for an individual with disability who needs it to access their housing, not allowing a person with a disability to have a service animal when there's a no pet policy in place on the property. And lastly, not adjusting zoning policies when needed to allow for a group home for an individual for individuals with disabilities. So it's not always a housing provider that has the responsibility to make these accommodations. Sometimes it's other decision makers in housing as well. I see a question in the chat about whether LIHTC properties would be included, and those are federally assisted properties. So how should reasonable accommodation requests be handled? We're going to talk about this in a general way, and then we're going to zoom in on some of the specifics around assistance animals. It's important that the request can be made at any point in the tenancy. So it doesn't have to be made up front as someone's inquiring about a unit, signing a lease, or moving in. It can happen 5 to 10 years into a tenancy. It can happen right before someone's moving out. Why? Because assistance, people's disability-related needs may change over time. Maybe there's a chronic condition that worsens, or an accident happens, and someone's needs are different than they used to be. So it's important that a housing provider is responsive to a request whenever it comes about. And federal guidance is clear that requests can be made either in writing or verbally. We strongly recommend tenants make requests in writing, so that way there's a paper trail. They can point to this documentation that they did submit the request on this date and this is what was requested. But verbal requests are equally as valid. The request does need to be reasonable and it needs to be necessary for the resident to use and enjoy the property. And a housing provider or manager has a responsibility to treat residents who are making these requests fairly and to respond in a timely manner. All right, so when a housing provider is presented with a reasonable accommodation request, they need to establish two criteria. So first off, does the person seeking the accommodation fall under the protected class of disability? Is there that substantial impact to one or more areas of a person's daily living? And then secondly, does that person have a disability-related need for the accommodation? So is there that nexus to their disability and what they're requesting? And if the answers to both of these criteria are yes, and the request is reasonable, do you think they should deny the request or accept the request? Feel free to pop that in the chat with a quick yes or no. Should they deny it or should they accept it? All right, I'm seeing one accept, two accepts. All right. Yes, you're right. This was not a trick question. They should accept or grant that request. Now they can request some documentation to verify the individual's disability and disability-related need. Now I want to note that if the disability is observable and the disability-related need is also observable, they don't need any further documentation. So if someone would come into the office in a wheelchair, requesting a ramp for a unit that has stairs, it's very clear what their disability is, what their disability-related need is, and what their request is. So there should not be any further documentation requested in that situation. But if a disability is not observable, then it's fine to ask for further documentation. Oftentimes, this documentation takes the form of a medical note of need. It can be from a primary care doctor, but it could also be from any other licensed care professional that has reasonable knowledge of this person's condition. So it can be from their psychiatrist, their psychologist, their therapist, their podiatrist, whoever is providing care to them that has knowledge of their condition and is a licensed professional. Sometimes this documentation may come from another agency, whether it's a determination of disability from a governmental agency, receipt of disability benefits or services, or eligibility for housing assistance because of a disability. And that's because someone else has already done the due diligence in the situation. They've collected the evidence needed to establish someone's eligibility for these benefits or services, and so the housing provider should accept that. You can learn more about documentation at the link on the slide here, which goes to HUD's 2020 guidance on assessing a person's need for an assistance animal. A follow-up question that I often get when doing these presentations is, well, what's reasonable and how do I determine what's actually reasonable in this situation? And the reality is that the assessment of reasonableness is on a case-by-case basis. There are some factors that should be considered, including the cost of the accommodation requested, financial resources of the provider or manager, the benefits of the requested accommodation to the person making the request, as well as the availability of alternatives to the accommodation that's being requested. And there are some reasons why these requests might be denied. So a housing provider or manager can deny the request in a few situations, such as if the needed documentation isn't provided. If that specific request would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others, that could be denied as well. If the request would cause substantial physical damage to the property or place an undue burden on the provider, and lastly, if the request would fundamentally alter the nature of the provider or manager's operations, that could be denied as well. However, this denial shouldn't be the end of the conversation. That should be the housing provider's cue to enter the interactive process, which is just a conversation with the tenant to see what reasonable alternatives exist that might meet this individual's disability-related housing needs. Now, this discussion must take place in a timely manner. There shouldn't be weeks and months on end going between communications. And it's important to know that there likely will be some negotiation and or conversation to determine an effective resolution. I highly recommend that this process is fully documented and saved in the housing provider's records and sent to the tenants as well. So that way everyone has a summary of what was discussed and what's been decided. Now, a housing provider should not ask the following things, should steer very far away from these as they're in these discussions. So don't ask the nature and severity of the disability. Do not ask questions that lead a tenant to disclose privileged medical information. Don't ask to see that tenant's medical records, and don't ask if the tenant is able to live independently. A tenant has the right to medical privacy, and the housing provider does not need to know these specifics in order to make a decision. All right, you all have been patient. We are going to service and support animals, which are both types of assistance animals. So I thought it was important to lay the groundwork of our fair housing laws and protections, who has those protections, and to go into the reasonable accommodation process before we talk about the specifics around animals. So let's start with terminology. Assistance animals is that broad umbrella term, and that includes both service animals, and emotional support animals, which are often abbreviated to ESAs. Sometimes these are also referred to as support animals. So both of these types of animals are assistance animals and are covered by fair housing protections both at the state and the federal level. Therapy animals are a separate type of animals, and they're for use in therapeutic settings and are not covered by fair housing protections. I also want to note that pets are not assistance animals. They are animals that are kept for recreational purposes and are also not covered by fair housing protections. So service animals are generally trained to perform a specific task. Generally, they are supporting someone with a physical disability, although that disability may or may not be obvious. Most times, a service animal is a dog. In some limited situations, it might be a mini horse. And some examples of what they do include pulling a wheelchair, providing mobility support, guiding individuals with vision impairment, or detecting and alerting individuals of oncoming seizures. They can do an incredibly wide range of things, and it's pretty remarkable the training that they're able to do to assist individuals with disabilities. Support animals, or ESAs, are less likely to have any type of special training, but they still serve an important function for an individual with a disability. Federal guidance states that a support animal can be any type of common household animal. So you can see the picture there on the screen, a dog, a cat, a turtle, a bird, any type of animal that might commonly be kept in a household as a pet. Um, Federal guidance does state that if there is a more exotic type of animal that's needed for emotional support or support of an individual, there can be some justification requested on what tasks and support this animal is able to do for the individual with a disability. So examples of what these animals can do include alleviating anxiety, reducing depression, keeping someone calm, and making them feel safe. Oftentimes, they're helping a person to manage a condition that we can't see and is not obvious. So oftentimes, housing providers may have more questions or a little more resistance to support animals that are supporting individuals with a not observable condition because it's just a little bit less obvious what this animal does and what the need is. But these animals are equally protected under our fair housing laws. I do see a question in the chat on whether we'll be making this slideshow available to participants. And yes, I will be sending these slides out after the presentation along with a copy of the recording. I want to note that Pennsylvania legislators passed the Assistance and Service Animal Integrity Act in 2018 in response to concerns about animals being represented as assistance animals, even if they weren't truly assistance animals. So they did pass this act, which makes it unlawful to falsely represent that, say, a pet would be an assistance animal or a service animal if they, in fact, are not. Let's talk licensure and certification. Under our fair housing laws, there's no certification or licensure that's required to establish that an animal is a service or support animal. So you don't need any of the vests or special tags that you see on the screen there. Um, if an animal is a service animal that goes out in public to provide support to an individual may want to have a vest on their dog so that way other folks know that this is a service animal and not a pet so they don't bother them while they're working. But there's no need for any of these items in a housing space. And there's also many fraudulent and exploitative sites that make people believe that these certifications and vests are required when they are not, especially in a housing situation. Now, another business model that that makes things a little complicated are online letter providers. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see an advertisement and some language from a website that's advertising ESA letters. So HUD did address these letters in the 2020 guidance um, about this issue. And I'm going to read the language verbatim because I think it's pretty clear. So some websites sell certificates, registrations, and licensing documents for assistance animals to anyone who answers certain questions or participates in a short interview and pays a fee. In HUD's experience, such documentation from the internet is not by itself sufficient to reliably establish that an individual has a non-observable disability or disability-related need for an assistance animal. By contrast, many legitimate, licensed healthcare professionals deliver services remotely, including over the internet. One reliable form of documentation is a note from a person's healthcare professional that confirms a person's disability and/or need for an animal when the provider has personal knowledge of the individual. And that's coming from that HUD 2020 guidance. So teletherapy, telehealth, that's a service that's used today more than ever. So simply getting a letter from a care professional that's licensed in another state, that's not to say that a letter isn't legitimate, but if a housing provider would question the documentation and think that it might not be legitimate, they could ask some questions to make sure that that this provider does have reasonable knowledge of this person's condition. Remember, we're not asking any questions about the diagnosis, about someone's condition itself, but a housing provider can ask for information about that person's disability-related need. I see there's a question in the chat about no certification or licensure being required. Can you just tell the landlord? And that's where that documentation from a care provider can come in. And that letter can state that this animal is needed for this function for this individual who qualifies as an individual with a disability under fair housing protections. And I'm also seeing another question in the chat about talking to healthcare providers about ESAs and ESA number letters. Seeing instances where providers state that we don't do that, we don't provide letters. And that's something that I've also heard as well. There's certain providers and certain healthcare systems that that generally don't provide that. So if that's the case, I would encourage you to talk with another provider. If you have a different provider that might be able to speak to your condition and your need for an assistance animal. So that way you're not resorting to going to an online letter provider, which are less reliable. So a housing provider can require that all individuals on their premises follow state and local regulations, such as licensing and vaccinations as applicable by state and local laws and regs. So this would be all animals, not just assistance animals, but it would need to be for pets on the property as well. Issue violations if an animal's conduct violates the rules of the housing provider. If that animal is being extremely disruptive, if they're being aggressive and violent, if they're violating established rules, a housing provider does have the right to issue those violations. And a tenant can be held financially responsible if that animal causes damage to the housing unit beyond normal wear and tear. A housing provider cannot put limits on breeds or impose weight limits on assistance animal requests. So even if a property has these restrictions for pets, they must be waived for assistance animals. A housing provider should be cautious about citing insurance policy cost as undue burden. So, right, we had stated that undue burden could be a reason for denial. Um, but a person should do due diligence before denying based on their insurance policy. They should check into other alternatives for insurance um, and see if they're able to obtain coverage that will enable them to have this assistance animal on their property. And there is a memo linked at the bottom of the screen from HUD that does speak to that. Secondly, a housing provider can't pass along additional expenses by charging extra fees, rent, or requiring extra security deposits, because that would be charging different terms and conditions for an individual with a disability. A question that often comes up in training settings is what to do when someone's request for an assistance animal or any type of reasonable accommodation request can impact other residents. So if another resident voices disability-related concerns, it's important to work to resolve these issues through the interactive process, right? We want to make sure that both tenants um, with disabilities are able to have their needs met. So we've got an example, a resident who's requesting an ESA, but another resident discloses that they're allergic to cat dander. Um, how would you handle that situation if you were the housing provider? I'd encourage folks to put in the chat any ideas of ways that a housing provider could address both of these disability-related needs. And I'll pause a moment to allow folks to put stuff in the chat. There's a clarifying question in the chat. Are these individuals residents in the same unit? Typically, it's residents in other units that would raise objections to this. So for this example, we'll say they live in separate units in the same building. Relocating a resident, providing the option to move to a different unit, an air purifier, the animal stays in the unit, keep the cat inside, having an air filter. Yeah, these are all great options that could be explored through that interactive process to see what is going to be able to allow one tenant to have their disability related needs met by having that assistance animal provide that needed support, but also making sure that another tenant is able to breathe. Let's see, not allowing the cat to go into the other person's unit. Absolutely. There are some breeds of cats who are hypoallergenic as well. That could be part of the discussion as well. And I do want to note that emotional support animals, those have rights inside an individual's unit. They don't have the same protections in common spaces and things like that. If it's a service animal, then they have rights to be out in public places and in all areas of the facility. So if it is an emotional support animal, um, noting that it's to be kept in the unit can help to clarify that. But it can be challenging to kind of work through the situation with all of the emotions and concerns that can arise. So you're welcome to call our agency or to reach out to a local fair housing agency if you have questions or concerns. So what are some best practices for reasonable accommodation requests, such as assistance animals? Well, a housing provider should have an established policy on how they're going to handle these requests. Make sure that they're documenting everything in writing. Make sure that they're only asking for the information that they need to process the request, allowing sufficient time for documentation to be submitted, but then responding back in a timely manner. Federal guidance states that within 10 days is reasonable. And then lastly, making sure that they're engaging in interactive dialogue to meet the needs of the tenant. All right, I'm going to briefly go over the complaint process at PHRC. If someone believes that they've been unfairly denied an assistance animal, they do have the right to file a complaint with our agency, and I want you to understand that process, and I want housing providers to understand what that process looks like as well. I think we will still have a couple minutes for questions at the end, so if you have any questions, please feel free to get those in the chat so that we can address them in a timely manner. But the complaint process starts by having someone contact our agency, and there's a number of ways that you can do that. You can call our main number, you can call one of the regional offices, you can send us an email, you can go on our website, and to get in touch with us and let us know that you're having an issue. And you'll get connected with our intake team, and they do a fantastic job at talking with potential complainants, people who think they want to file a complaint, making sure that they're able to fill out a housing questionnaire to make sure that we've got all the information that we need to assess if a complaint is jurisdictional and timely. So if you're filing a complaint, you can expect to provide your contact information, what you experience, as well as who you're filing the complaint against, who you believe violated your civil rights, and then our team will assess that. So they'll make sure that it's jurisdictional and timely. Was it within that 180 days from the date of the last harm? Was it related to housing? Do you believe it was because of a protected class? And then that complaint gets finalized, and then the person who was filed against gets notified. And we call that individual the respondent. It then goes into investigation. So the complainant is asked to provide information to a neutral investigator who's responsible for investigating if there was a violation of our state law. And they may do this by asking for documents, interviewing witnesses, or holding a fact-finding hearing, finding other ways to obtain evidence. We've got a fantastic mediation team, so mediation services might be an option to quickly and confidentially respond and resolve a case, but that depends on the facts of the case, and both parties do need to agree to mediation for mediation to move forward. Even if parties don't elect to mediate it, the situation, the investigator will also explore if it's possible to settle the case before coming to a finding. So if the case does proceed to a finding after all the evidence is collected and assessed, there's two potential outcomes. So probable cause means that there was enough evidence gathered to establish that discrimination did occur, and no probable cause means the opposite. There wasn't enough evidence to determine that discrimination did occur. If no probable cause is found, that's pretty much the end of the road. But if probable cause is found, then the case might advance to conciliation, to public hearing in front of one of our hearing examiners or commissioners, or it might be filed in court. And at this point, our agency is no longer neutral. Our goal is to seek a remedy for the discrimination that occurred. We often get questions about the amount of time it takes to investigate a case, and it really varies based on the evidence, how quickly parties respond, as well as other factors. What can be achieved by filing a complaint? Uh, well, if probable cause is found and the case advances, or if there's a settlement or a mediation, there's a number of things that can be achieved. It could be that that reasonable accommodation or modification is made, so that assistance animal is granted, whereas it had been denied before. Could be that there's changes to the lease or other policies. So say they were charging pet rent to assistance animals. We'll get that policy changed so that way all tenants are able to fully exercise their fair housing rights. Could be a posting of fair housing notices, letting everyone know about their rights and responsibilities, as well as training for respondents to make sure that they're fully aware of their responsibilities as housing providers. There are often some fees involved, so reimbursing for fees and out-of-pocket expenses related to the complaint or due to the discrimination. In housing cases, there's also money for humiliation and embarrassment, which is similar to pain and suffering. And then lastly, if it advances to public hearing, there may be a civil penalty that's assessed as a violation of our state law. There are a couple recent housing awards on the screen here, and you can see that it really varies in terms of amounts, in terms of protected class, in terms of the act of harassment or act of discrimination as well. I want to close out with giving you a few fair housing resources for further learning and understanding after we get off the line today. So we do have free housing training programs. I'd be happy to schedule one with your team if you'd like myself or another member of the PHRC team to come on site or hop on a Zoom or Teams meeting to share with you fair housing information. We do have this monthly Fair Housing Empower webinar series. So next month, we're going to be talking about sexual harassment in housing, and that's going to be presented by Director Griffin. And that'll be happening at the end of August, I believe on the 27th at 12 p.m. We've got lots of written resources, brochures, and fact sheets on our website. We also have a show on PCN TV called PHRC Speaks Fair Housing Forward, and there's a link to all of our past episodes there. We have a white paper called The State of Fair Housing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that details a lot of the housing barriers that are impacting individuals in protected classes. And lastly, we send out a quarterly fair housing e-newsletter to keep you in the loop with news, guidance, cases, and resources for you. But with that, I'm going to close out our session today. You'll see there's a QR code on the screen, and I am also going to put a link in the chat as well. That'll take you to a survey. So you can let us know what you thought about this presentation, what was great, what was not so great, what you'd want to see in the future. And it will also allow you to download a certificate for your records that states that you participated in this hour-long training on assistance animals. We've got a couple minutes, and I see that we've got a question in the chat about concerns with leash laws for common areas of a housing community that would apply to both pets and ESAs. A housing provider would want to make sure that any leash laws or rules are not specifically targeting ESAs or service animals, and that would apply equally to both pets and ESAs. Because you'd want terms and conditions to be fair for all of the tenants. Are there any other questions that have popped up either about assistance animals? Great question. What's the difference between national origin and ancestry? National origin refers to the country that you're from. So if you're an immigrant from another country, that would be national origin, and ancestry refers to broader family heritage and the country that your family may have come from. And I do also want to note that as part of the complaint process, we don't ask anything about immigration status, and we would never report any potential complainants to any immigration enforcement. We also do have translation services for folks that would need translation in order to file a complaint and navigate the complaint process as well. Other questions that you have? All right. Well, I would like to thank everyone for participating as part of this training, for spending their lunch hour with PHRC today. And I'll note that we will be sending out these slides and this recording within the next week. And if you have any questions, my email is on the slide, and please feel free to reach out to me. Oh, I'm seeing a great question in the chat about how many ESA animals you are permitted. There isn't a specific amount, but I do want to note that that if you do require more than one ESA, you should provide some justification and documentation as to your need for multiple animals. What do these animals what do they do for you? So if you've got a dog and a cat, maybe the dog is for mobility support and the cat is for emotional support. Your provider should be able to write you a letter to be able to provide that information to a housing provider. There's also situations where there might be more than one person in a household that need an assistance animal. So that can be another situation in which multiple assistance animals would need to be present in a household. Great question. All right, it is 1 o'clock. So with that, I'm going to close out. Thank you so much for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your day.